Good morning, Grove. So would you agree we live in an amazing universe? Would you agree with that? So you tell me, created or evolved? Created, would you say accidental or intentional? Intentional. We're living in interesting days. Everywhere you turn, people of faith are being mocked. Have you heard it? I'm sure you not only have heard it, I'm sure, truth be known, that it's probably happened to you. You've been on the receiving end of some kind of verbal barrage. There are people out there who believe you honestly have to be some kind of moron, an idiot, to believe that God exists, which is an interesting thought. Because the vast majority of people who live on the planet believe that God exists. I mean, if you just would take the major religions of the world, Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Mormonism. I mean, if you take the religions, while they disagree about a lot of things, on this one thing they do agree. There is a God, and He's responsible for creating everything that is. The reality is the vast majority of people who live on the planet today believe there's a God. But what I want to do is put these numbers in perspective for you, all right? So look at this. Over 5 billion people on the planet absolutely believe without a doubt that there is a God. While the number of atheists, people who absolutely believe that there is no God, are about 150 million, or 2%, actually less than 2% of the world's population. Now, I mean, just to look at it in these figures, I mean, the numbers are staggering. Especially when you consider that over the last 150 years, modern science has been ratcheting things up. They've been turning up the heat. Their teaching, modern science, is this: God does not exist. The voice coming from science is that not only that God doesn't exist, there's no need for Him. Science has come to the point where it believes it can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they can explain everything sans God. No God, without God, which makes God somewhat of an antique, makes God a relic, useless. We don't need Him to create, and we definitely don't need His laws or His rules either, which is really what this debate is all about. Do you hear me? And I want you to hear this, friends, and maybe I want you to write it down. See, if there is a God, then He is the authority. And if He's the authority, He gets to make the rules. And if He created and He makes the rules, then we as human beings need to live under those rules. Do you get what I'm saying? If there is no God, you can do whatever you want to do. But if there is a God, then you must obey Him. So don't miss this point. This is not about whether things evolved or created. This is about authority. Who's going to be in charge? For many people, what they want to do is say, I'm in charge. I want to make the rules. I want to do what I want to do. So we come to evolution, the get rid of God theory. A few years ago, I ran across an interesting quote. Here's what Ron Carlson said. He said, in grammar school, they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fairy tale. In the university, they taught me that a frog turning into a prince was a fact. Really, they're not even waiting for the university to teach that anymore. Your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, they're being bombarded by that on a daily basis, even in elementary school. They're being taught that we are nothing more than a great cosmic accident. There was a primordial soup, and there was some stuff over there and some stuff over there, and that stuff somehow got together and created a couple of enzymes, and then that enzyme and those enzymes kind of came together, and they, over the course of many, many years, formed a cell, and over the course of a few trillion years, that cell evolved into everything we see today. Science would have you believe the story boils down to that simple collusion of stuff. But here's the reality. What is being taught as scientific fact today is really nothing more than a theory. It's not the fact of evolution, it's the theory of evolution. Theory of evolution. Would you say that with me? The theory of evolution. And on top of that, it's a relatively new theory, and even more, it's a theory that's full of holes. And if you really want to get to the bottom line, it's this. It takes a lot more faith to believe the theory of evolution than it does to believe that God created everything. Could somebody please say amen to that? Now, you might have thought that the theory of evolution is old, But what I want you to know is it's really quite new. In fact, it's less than 200 years old. For the large percentage of man's existence on the earth, which is 6,000 years plus, and it depends on how you want to count it, whether you're a new earther or you're an old earther, whether you believe the generations of the Bible are very deliberate and you can add them all up and get to 6,000 something, or whether you maybe believe more like 10,000, or whatever it is that you believe. For the large percentage of man's existence on the earth, it's been held by everyone that there was a God who was responsible for all that is. In fact, just 300 years ago, from the 1400s to the 1700s, scientists, astronomers, the leading thinkers of the day looked to the heavens and saw God. Men like Copernicus, guys like Galileo, people like Newton, they looked up and they said, God is amazing, God is awesome. But in the mid-1700s, during the age of enlightenment, things began to shift. Now, it's funny, really, because when I think about all of this age, the age of enlightenment, I think that's kind of funny, you know? Because here's what the Bible says. Psalm chapter 14, Psalm chapter 53. They begin the same way. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Could you say amen to that? Yes? It is foolish to believe that. So it's interesting that we call the 18th century the age of enlightenment, when in all of our wisdom and reason we were beginning to cut God out. I mean, God wouldn't call the 1800s the age of enlightenment. He would call it the age of foolishness. In German universities, the philosophers and scientists in the 1700s began to believe that the universe is closed. Their thought was that if there is a God, and probably at that point a lot of them would have said there was, they believed that what God did was he created and then he went far away. And that the universe was left by itself just to flow under these natural laws that God created and then he moved. It was the beginning of a theological system called deism. Have you ever heard that? Deism? That's the thought. God made, God left. God does not intervene. He has nothing to do with his creation. He's gone. And it began to give rise to the philosophical thought of rationalism. I'm throwing out quite a few words here. You'd be good to kind of look a few of these words up in the dictionary. But basically, rationalism is this teaching is that God is far away and man is left on his own, so we need to depend upon ourselves. And the thought is that we're totally dependable. The thought was that man was capable of taking care of himself and solving all of his own problems. So would you agree with that? Are we capable of solving all of our own problems? I don't think so. In fact, it almost makes me laugh. It seems to me that the only thing that man is capable of doing is digging a bigger hole. But the philosophers in the 17 and 1800s would disagree. Men like Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, they were teaching that man is supreme. And that led to the rise of a guy you've probably heard of. His name was Charles Darwin. Have you heard of him? Born in 1809, he was just 27 years old when he got on a ship named the Beagle. He sailed for the Galapagos Islands for what would become a trip of infamy. 23 years later, in 1859, 100 years before I was born, he published The Origin of the Species. It made its way to the booksellers. And from there, science began to turn completely away from any God hypothesis. Now, it's interesting to note that as all of this, that this is all beginning to turn around. 100 years later, 160 years later, in our day and age, things are turning around. There are a myriad of scientists today who are rejecting the notion, the theory of evolution. And they're returning to the thought of an intelligent designer who's behind it all. And the reason is that the more we know, the more we see, the deeper we can look, the more powerful our microscopes get, the more powerful our telescopes get, the farther we can see, the deeper we can see, the more we understand that it's obvious that evolution could have never happened. Science, when it's allowed to truly speak, and I want to say this in a way that you hear it, because science is not always allowed to speak. In many circles, science is not allowed to put forth the evidence. In many circles, science has cut off half the possible answers, because here's the hypothesis. There is no God. There is no God. So we enter into the survey of what we're looking at with this truth. There is no God. So we look at all this evidence, and the evidence looks like there might be a God, looks like it's pointing to a God, looks like it's pointing to a designer, and science just cuts it off and says, no, you don't understand. There is no God. There has to be some other explanation for all of this. Even in our schools, the theory of creation is never mentioned. In many circles, teachers are in a lot of trouble because they might say there's another way to think about this. If you hold to a creation theory, you'll be ridiculed at best, fired, and become an anathema at worst. Watch the movie Expelled. You can probably rent it on Amazon.com or on Netflix. See the movie Expelled with Ben Stein and see how true that is. 150 years ago, Darwin said that his theory would either be proven right or wrong by the facts. He says, all I'm presenting is a theory that things evolved, that it moved from a very simple cell into a very complex organism. And he was saying that if that's true, then the fossil record is going to bear that out, because there's going to be all these transitionary fossil types that will show how a fish became an alligator became a bird, how a bird became a monkey, how a monkey became man. The problem is, after 150 years of searching, and I'm telling you, diligently searching, the fossil record is missing all of the transitionary links. And that's why I said when science is allowed to speak, because if we were really listening, if science was really listening, we would conclude that there's a lot more evidence to back up the argument for God than to disavow him. And that's what this series is all about. It's about looking. For the next few weeks, we're going to be looking. I'm going to encourage you to open up your eyes and look. Open up your eyes and look, and then allow your mind to reason. I want to encourage you to allow the evidence to speak for itself. I want to give you some encouragement that your belief in God is not ridiculous. There is a reason. There are a lot of reasons as to why you should put your faith in God and not evolution. In fact, here's what David said in Psalm 19. He said, the heavens declare the glory of God. I love that, don't you? David said, just look up, and if you will look up, the heavens will declare God's glory. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. There is no speech, no language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. It doesn't matter what language you speak. If you look up, David says, you can see God. I think he's right, wouldn't you? Paul's echoing the same thing in Romans chapter 1. He says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen. You just have to look up. And if you will look up, it will be clear there is a God. How will we know? It's understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Paul is talking here about coming to God. We are without excuse about turning our attention and our worship to God. We got to get our eyes off of ourselves and turn to God. The problem is we want to worship ourselves, and so we've tried to do away with God. Listen, friends, the words are true. Do the heavens proclaim the glory of God? The answer is absolutely. They pour forth speech. Listen, I believe God's invisible qualities, his eternality, is seen in the heavens. And that's what we're going to be looking at over the next 9 weeks. Is it reasonable to believe that there is a God? The answer is yes. Absolutely yes. Now, you may want to do some extra reading as we're moving through this, and I want to encourage that. If you know anything about me, I'm a reader. And as I've been prepping for this series and thinking about this, I have about 50 books in my library that I bought. And when I buy books, I buy them on both sides of the fence. Don't think that I'm just reading all the theological proof. I'm reading the stuff on the other side from the atheists, from the evolutionists. I read over here, I've read several books by just an angry atheist by the name of Richard Dawkins. Have you heard of him? He's written a book called The God Delusion. I'm not promoting it here. Don't buy it, all right? It's ridiculous. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. So I put a couple of books back in the back table. One is called The Case for the Creator. The other one is where I took the title for the series, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And if you want to read along with us, pick up those books. We bought a bunch of them, and if we run out of them, we'll get more. Every one of you ought to have both of these books in your hands, and you ought to be reading them this summer. And with all that said, I want to take you back to the very first page of the Bible, Genesis 1. And this week I want to encourage you to look at the original theory of everything. Where did everything come from? Where did we come from? Where did I come from? Well, Genesis lays it out. Genesis 1 and 2 is a picture of an awesome being, a supernatural being at work. And the first 10 words of the Bible lay out the story simply and succinctly. Here's what Moses wrote, Genesis 1:1. In fact, let's read it together. Here's what Moses said. He said, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The wording through Genesis 1 and 2, if you'll read it, and read it maybe even with a highlighter or a pencil or a pen in your hand, it's really interesting. Because as you read Genesis 1 and 2, I want to make sure that you notice how many times the text tells us that God was responsible for all that is, for the creation. It says 6 times that he created. It says 3 times that he formed. It says 10 times that he made. And over and over and over again, Genesis records that God said. The Bible makes it clear that God is the one who brought everything into existence. So why did God write it down? Why did God put it into written form, into Hebrew? Bereshit bara Elohim v'her hashamayim v'her haaretz. Why did God say it? I'll tell you why he wrote it down. He wrote it down because he knew the day was coming when men would question all of this. He knew the day was coming when man in all of his foolishness would write him off. So he wanted it declared very simply in the very beginning of his book, I am the beginning. I am the one. I am the one behind everything. And this morning I want to encourage you to think through the Genesis account. And as you think it through, I want to encourage you to come to a couple of conclusions. In fact, 5 conclusions I want to put in front of you as we begin this series that I just simply don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And the first conclusion is this: the universe and everything in it had a beginning. The universe had a beginning. The universe had a beginning. Say that with me. The universe had a beginning. The implication is laid out in the first 3 words of the Bible, in the beginning. It's one word in Hebrew. But in our English language, it's 3. In the beginning. What the Bible teaches is that the earth, the universe, has not always existed. It's not eternal. It is not static. It had a beginning. It began. And I want you to hear me say that, friends, with no uncertain terms. It had a beginning, and it's an important truth for you to grasp. The universe is not eternal. It hasn't always been here. For evolution to have a prayer of a chance of working, there had to be gazillions, and I mean gazillions of years available. I'm not talking about billions of years or even trillions. Nancy, thank you. That's very kind of you. Do you have backwash in here, or it's all okay? Thanks. Oh, the pause that refreshes, right? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I can't talk, lots of people say that's a blessing, so be careful. The universe, for evolution to work, people are going to say that the universe has had to be here for gazillions of years. And I'm not just talking about a billion or a million. I'm talking about trillions, times trillions, times trillions, times trillions. The universe is so complex. The cells of your body are so finely tuned and remarkable in their design and function. There is absolutely no theoretical way that it could have just evolved. No possible way. We're going to talk about that in a few weeks. But the evolutionists made the argument that it is possible if given enough time. So maybe when you were a little kid, you started hearing about millions of years. We're not talking millions anymore. As we have got these electron microscopes and we can look deeper and deeper and deeper and we see a cell for what it really is, we're beginning to understand that there's no absolute way that over 1 billion years that could have evolved. And I'm just telling you, you can make the timetable eternal, and there's no possible way. The point is that from the very big things in the world to the very small, from the largest stars to the atom, they could not have evolved. No way. So the evolutionist just elongates the line. The thinking is more time makes this not such a big deal. It's just one small baby step at a time. And that's what Dawkins says. You know, it's just one little step at a time. You don't have to climb Mount Everest today. You just got to get there over a course of a few gazillion years. In their teaching, the universe has been here forever. We have that long to make it happen. The problem is all the evidence points in the opposite direction. The evidence shows that the universe is far from eternal. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. And this is really a big problem. It's an ignored problem. And it's ignored because it's such a magnificent problem. And it leads to an even bigger problem. Where did all the stuff in the universe come from? I mean, really honestly, where did that stuff and that stuff, where did these elements come from? Where did this material come that was built into these enzymes, that was built into this cell? Seriously, where did it come from? Now, in philosophical circles, an argument has risen called the Kalam argument, Kalam. And in this argument, here's what it says. Whatever begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And that's the incredible message of Genesis chapter 1. In fact, the message of the first 10 words of the Bible is that in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God created. The universe, the world, time, it all had a beginning. And when you look at the evidence, friends, as we're going to do in a few weeks, you're going to have to say it's absolutely true. The evidence points that there is a beginning, which leads to a second powerful conclusion that comes right out of Genesis. The universe is not eternal, it had a beginning, and God is the cause of it. We live in a cause and effect world. And everybody in here understands that things work that way. If there's an effect, there had to be a cause behind it. It's the Kalam argument. We reach this conclusion every day. You see a building standing. Drive by downtown and look at one of the skyscrapers, and what's your assumption? Did over just a few trillion years, things and elements kind of in wind whip this building into place? No. We look at that and we say, somebody put it there. Somebody brought some boards, some nails, some glues, some wire, some pipe, some cement, and they formed this building. It was created. It had a beginning. It was caused by something. When you hold a computer in your hand, what do you believe? That all the pieces just kind of melded themselves together into this little box, and suddenly there was a screen, and if you could plug it into an electrical current, which also just happened to come from someplace, that it would light up and it would do all these things? No. You believe that somebody envisioned this, somebody dreamed it, somebody thought it out, and somebody caused it to be. And the universe is no different. If it had a beginning, it means that there was a cause. And the cause of the universe is God. And that takes us back to the Kalam argument. The Kalam argument actually makes three conclusions. The first conclusion is, since the universe began to exist, it must have a cause. Must. And then second, it unapologetically declares that the only way to describe a cause for the universe is to surmise that the cause must be God. And then thirdly, it says, therefore, God must exist. How do we know God exists? We have the universe as proof. It had to have a cause. And the only cause could be something like God, which means he exists. And honestly, this is one of the conclusions that drove Einstein absolutely crazy. You may not know this, and again, we'll talk more in depthly about this in a few weeks, but when he was coming up with his theory of relativity, have you heard of that, the theory of relativity? When he was writing this and he was dreaming this and kind of envisioning all this, he ran into some problems. Because as he was writing this all together, the theory of evolution was being thrown out the door. Einstein was coming to the conclusion that if the numbers of relativity were accurate, then that means there had to be a beginning of the universe. And he hated that thought. He hated the thought, so he fudged the numbers because he didn't like what a beginning meant. A beginning meant a beginner. A beginning meant a cause. A beginning meant God. The problem was that all of the evidence, all of it, was pointing to exactly that, a point in time that was a bang, a boom, a God saying, let there be. Now, one of the things that has made me chuckle over the years is the argument that Dawkins makes in his book about this God who supposedly created all this. In his book, The God Delusion, Dawkins scoffs that if there is a God, then he must be bigger than everything that is. He must be bigger than the universe. He must be outside of space and time. He must be over it, bigger than it, able to straddle it. His point is that being a being of that size, of that magnificence, of that magnitude is just really, really, really impossible for his little feeble mind to come into contact with. But that's exactly the point that God makes about God. Notice two things in the Genesis text that it says about God. Number one, it says that God spoke. God's the cause of everything that is. And amazingly, everything came into existence simply by his speaking it into existence. Read Genesis 1. Each day begins with, "And God said." And here's the second truth about Genesis. Everything came into being ex nihilo. Ex nihilo. Which means out of nothing. God spoke the creation into existence, and he took nothing to make everything. You want an explanation about where all the stuff of the universe came from? Here it is. Genesis 1. There was nothing. There was a God. There's a heaven. There's an eternal being. There are angels. We know that from Scripture. Satan fell long before the creation of the world, long before that. Those texts in Ezekiel and Isaiah are pointing back before time as we know it, when Lucifer fell out of heaven. So there was this being, there was this God, this eternal being who's created a heavenly kingdom, who's created angels, and now he decides to bring a universe into place, and he just simply speaks, and out of nothing, everything that is comes. God's voice is so powerful, so amazingly powerful, that he can speak and make it happen. Dawkins was right. The God of the Bible is huge. Bigger than, outside of, more powerful than his creation, able to span it. Omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent, everywhere he is present. All-powerful, omnipotent. What's amazing to me is this. Atheists would have an easier time believing that everything blindly assembled itself from a bunch of organic stuff that has always been just floating around without any direction or guidance. It's somehow easier to believe that you are nothing more than a process of blind growth. But you know that a mindless process could never create information. A mindless process could never create life. So why would you put that on the universe? The smartest scientists in the world can't make life. The smartest scientists in the world can't make stuff. And believe me, they've been trying. They've been trying for years and years and years and years and years to try to make something out of nothing, and they can't do it. It really is easier to believe that there is a God behind it. And the conclusions of the Genesis account are really simple. Number one, there was a beginning to the universe. And number two, there was a cause to that beginning, and the cause was God. And that leads to a third conclusion, and it's a short diversion away from Genesis, if you'll allow me. But here's what I want you to hear. God is more than the cause of the universe. He is also the sustainer. Everybody who looks at the universe marvels at the precision that it runs by. Astronomers are able to predict in exacting detail exactly where things are going to be, where celestial beings will be. They know exactly when Halley's Comet is going to reappear. They know exactly where the moon is going to be in the sky. They know exactly what our position to the sun is. They know exactly where all the other planets are in the night sky and how you can see them and how you can find them. And the reason they know all of this, because they can predict it years in advance, the reason they know all this is because of the precision of the universe. It is like a finely tuned clock. So how does it work? Well, simply put, it works because God made it, and then he holds it. He sustains it. That's the message of Colossians 1. Colossians 1, Paul is writing, he's speaking of Jesus here. Here's what he says. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven, things on earth, visible, invisible, thrones, powers, rulers, authorities. All things were created by him, and they were created for him. It's all created for his glory, for his majesty. He is before, Jesus is before all things, and in him all things hold together. The words here are really simple and straightforward. Jesus is God. In case you were questioning who Jesus is, he is more than the Son of God. He is God. And he was before all things. And by him, all things were made by his voice. Who was that voice in Genesis 1? Jesus, God. Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit are not independent beings. They're separate in form, but they're all the same being. I can't explain it to you, but Jesus is God. Without him, the universe would fly apart. And you say, oh, Derek, the universe holds together by natural law. You know what? Okay. And who is the one that made the natural law? The name is Jesus. The Bible declares that place to be God. And let me put a fourth conclusion in front of you, all right? The creation was purposeful. In his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins goes to great ends to say the universe didn't come into existence by chance. It came into being by natural selection. Natural selection. Charles Darwin called it survival of the fittest. You know, the thing that's the strongest stands, and then other things stand because that thing stood. Whatever you call the process, in the end, it's really called chance. Something stood, other things stood off of that thing. It was designed. It wasn't designed. It wasn't created. It just happened because the stars happened to align themselves going that way. But that isn't the picture that comes out of Genesis. Genesis 1 teaches that everything that is was brought into existence by a very purposeful, intended action of God. God made things the way they are. He designed them to be the way that they are. He designed us to be the way that we are. He set all of this in motion, and he did it for precise reasons. It was purposeful. Everything falls into an order. You see that rising out of the creation days. Before plants could exist, there needs to be light. Before animals exist, there needs to be plants. Before man can exist, there needs to be a habitat to be able to sustain him. You start thinking about all the things that have to be put into place for you to be able to be alive. Food, air, heat, water. It has got to be more than a chance that all those things are in place, especially when you consider the intricacies of each and every one of those things. When you start taking every little block and seeing how unbelievably intricate it is, and you start adding them up. The first one makes it impossible. The second one makes it more than impossible. By the time you get to the end, it's just incalculable, impossible. And that's the message that comes out of the beginning verses in Genesis. As God put man and woman into that specially designed place called the Garden of Eden, their needs were met. And here's what I want you to see, friends. It was purposeful, but it was more than purposeful. It was relational. It was all for relationship. God desired to have a relationship with you. And that's where we get down in Genesis 1:26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." You were created. You were the height of the creation. You were given a mind, a brain. You have the ability to think and to reason and to choose because God knew that relationship depended upon this. If you can't think, if you can't reason, if you can't choose, you don't have a relationship. So God made you to have the ability to say yes and no. I have a wonderful wife, but you know what makes our relationship even better? She has a choice. And so do I. If I could just put a chip in her and make her say, "I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you," after a while I'd want to say, "Shut up." But when I have not put a chip in her, when she has the ability to look at me and say, "I love you," her choice makes it a wonderful thing. You were made after the likeness of your Creator. It wasn't an accident, it was purpose. You have the ability to think, to reason, to choose, because God wanted a relationship with you. So He created you with that ability. And it leads to one last conclusion that flies out of the Genesis account. The purpose gives our life meaning. Take away God, and all we are is an accident. And accidents have no meaning or purpose. That's why all these philosophies that were coming out of the age of enlightenment started breaking down. Because we started building up man to be this unbelievable, he is the supreme, he is the epitome, he's the top of the heap, and do away with God and throw him away. We don't need him. But when you got rid of the ultimate, what started happening is all the philosophies of despair started coming in, because rationalism, man is supreme, led to existentialism. There is no God, man is it, man can decide, but since there is no God, since there's no ultimate, then there are no rules. And so you know what? There is no purpose, there is no meaning. All you are is an accident. So to find meaning and purpose in your life, you're going to just have to figure it out on your own. There are no laws, there's no right and wrong. What's right for you is right for you, what's wrong for you is and if it's right for you but wrong for me, it's okay, because there is no meaning. Does that sound like the age that we live in? And it's just led to confusion. Because if you make me mad and I want to kill you and you say you don't have a right to kill, well, who are you? I mean, there's got to be a God someplace that is going to lay this down. If there's a right and a wrong, there's an ultimate. I mean, this is what led C.S. Lewis, the big-time atheist, to Jesus, to God. That there is an ultimate right and wrong. But if there is no God, if there is no ultimate, then there is no right and wrong, which means you have to make your own meaning in life. And eventually that breaks down, which has led to this nihilism thought. Years ago, this song came out, Dust in the Wind. All we are is dust in the wind. And this nihilistic thought that said, your life, you can't create meaning, your life is meaningless. The most noble thing you could do would put a gun in your hand and blow your head off, because your life has no meaning. You're only an accident. You take God out of the picture, friends, and the philosophies go to despair. At the end of the day, all of man's wisdom has led him to a hole that only brings ugliness. Which brings us back to Genesis 1. In fact, let's read it again. Moses wrote, he said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Do you believe it? Do you have faith that God spoke all these things and brought it into existence? Well, if you don't believe that, you have to believe that you're nothing more than chance. We're the products of a blind process that brought all that is into being. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next few weeks. And as we begin, I just want to declare in no uncertain terms, ready? I do not have enough faith to be an atheist. I don't. The coming 9 weeks are going to settle around the idea that it takes a lot more faith to deny the story of creation and pick up the theory of evolution. And that's why more and more people are turning their heads back. Because as the evidence is allowed to mount and the evidence is allowed to come out, more and more scientists are saying that could not have happened. Darwin would be saying that. It could not have happened. The theory does not bear out with the weight of all the evidence. I was wrong. It's not a theory of evolution. It's a fact of creation. And it's my hope, friends, that the next 9 weeks is going to boost your faith in God. Help you to understand in no uncertain terms that evolution didn't happen, that it doesn't exist. In the coming weeks, we're going to look at very big things like stars and the universe. And we're going to look at very small things like cells and DNA and atoms. We're going to take them apart. And as we take them apart, we're going to look at them and then we're going to wonder at them. Wonder in an awe type of way. Oh, wow. And then we're going to ask the question, could it have just happened? Or is there a God behind all of it? And if there is a God, He is the authority. And if there is a God, He is worthy of our worship. Would you agree, church? Amen. So let me encourage you. Strap on your seatbelts. Be here every week. Grab your neighbors, grab your friends. You come on, get these books, pick them up. Let's start reading together. And I encourage you to join in because it's going to be a lot of fun. Because there's a lot of reason to believe that there is a God and that He created. Bow your heads. Would you do that? And while you're doing that, let me just say all of this is not without implication, friends. If there's a God, He made you purposefully and He wants a relationship with you. And His desire more than anything else is to be close with you. That's His expectation. That's His desire. Will you let it be? Oh, Father, move in our hearts. I pray that You'll help us to see, to know. I pray, Father, You'll help us to wrap our minds around all of this unbelievable creation that we live in. And Father, I pray that You would be honored and You would be glorified as we not only seek to know You better, but come to the conclusion that You are and that You are worthy of all of our praise and all of our adoration. Father, I pray that You'll help us over the next few weeks to be enthused to know that all that is bears witness to all that You are. And I pray, Father, that You'll just drive us to that conclusion. And that You use these weeks to form in our minds a deeper faith in You, a deeper heart of worship for how great You are. And we lift it up in the name of the one who makes it possible, Jesus. And God's people said,